Okay, great. Hi everyone, my name is Hope. I'm a researcher and grad student in the Neuroscience and Language Lab just down the street over there in the Brain and Cognitive Sciences building. And today I want to tell you about some of the latest advances in the study of the human brain. To start, I'm going to tell you about two of the most famous interesting brains in the history of neuroscience. To do so though, we have to go back a couple hundred years, to the 1800s. Back then, a man named Phineas Gage was alive. This is Phineas. He worked on a railroad. He worked with big metal rods like this one that he's holding here. Now you might be wondering why Phineas's eye is closed like that. Well, that's because one day, while he was working, there was a big explosion. And that giant rod accidentally went up through his cheek, all the way through his head, and it damaged one of his eyes, and also took out a giant chunk of his brain. You can see here. You can see it modeled here. After this, he lost the ability to do a lot of the things that this part of the brain helps you to do, like planning and the control of his behavior and emotions and impulses. People found him very interesting, even back then, when they didn't know that much about the brain. Actually, he even came here to Boston so that some doctors could study him. Here's the paper that they published way back in 1848. Now let's zoom forward about 100 years. There was another man. His code name was Patient HM. He had part of his brain removed for medical reasons. This was still before we knew what different parts of the brain do. So they removed a whole part of his brain without knowing exactly what it did. You can see what parts they removed here, before surgery, after surgery. After this, he lost his ability to form new memories. He could remember lots of things from early in his life, approximately leading up to the time of the surgery, but nothing after that. Every day, he would wake up and not even remember that he had lost part of his brain at all. This is a quote of him saying what it was like to be in his head after his surgery. Now this was because he had lost the memory-forming part of his brain, the hippocampus. You can see notation here deep inside your brain. Actually, HM also lost some of the nearby surrounding tissue, just to be precise. Now, after this fateful surgery, HM also came to Boston so that people could study his brain over that way at Mass General Hospital. And he even came and worked with some researchers at MIT too. And after he died, his brain was preserved about 15 years ago. Back then, brain scanning technology was not very advanced. So we didn't get to study people's brains while they were using them. Though we could study some of their anatomy from these frozen brain slices, like the ones you saw in the demos back there, or Phineas Gage's skull, which was also kept and preserved and is now at Harvard Medical School. And even though many people have studied these specimens, they can only tell us so much. These cases and others like them really made us curious about what goes on inside the human brain. And as you can see from these interesting brains, losing parts of your brain can result in changes to your behavior or the loss of mental capabilities. However, the brain is a mysterious place. Here's another interesting brain. This is our friend, EG, and she is missing almost a fourth of her brain. And like Phineas Gage and HM before her, EG also came to be studied by scientists in Boston. But today, we can do so much more than what we could do in the past, largely in part to the advent of neuroimaging. Like our machine, the fMRI. It's a special piece of equipment, essentially a giant camera for the human body. You see, your brain is like a muscle. When you use it, you use oxygen, stored in your blood. So you might know, for instance, if you're to work out your arm a bunch, blood is going to rush over here. And we can measure that blood flow, and we call it the Bold signal, because we're measuring the blood and oxygen movement in your body. And we can look at that signal in your brain. This machine then takes pictures of the blood in your brain and watches where it moves when you do different things, as you can see here. So we now know that different parts of the brain do many different specialized functions. For instance, this part of the brain is activated when you listen to music, or this part of the brain, which is activated when you look at faces. We also know that these regions are all pretty similar across people, so that we all have these areas, in about the same place in each of our brains. And it's taking into account, of course, that each of our brains is still like a unique fingerprint. So the folds and crevices of any two brains are never exactly alike. This part was discovered by the head of our lab, Ed Fedorenko, who was really interested in the human capacity for language. She wanted to find which parts of the brain were used to process it. And that is what our lab studies now. But when we are, let's say, reading a book, we are also doing lots of other things. We're looking at the book, we're breathing, we're listening to the sounds around us, etc. So when we see which parts of the brain are activated while reading, we need to know whether it is just because of the shape of the book, maybe its pages or the font and the letters, or because of the act of reading itself and our understanding of the words. All of these different activities activate different parts of the brain. And so we want to find the brain regions that specifically process language and only language, not all that other stuff. To figure this out, we need to come up with a control. We try to think of something that is a lot like what we want to study, but that differs in the essence of what we are interested in. For instance, the essence of language. Ooh. So for her PhD, Ev, the head of our lab, thought to use a very well-matched control. Something that was similar to language, but in one important dimension, completely different. Maybe some of you have read the book Alice in Wonderland, and if so, you may have come across the Jabberwocky poem, which uses nonsense words instead of real words. They look a lot like words you might know, but they don't actually exist or mean anything, like brillig or outgrade. What does that mean? So Ev used a version of nonsense words to make her experiment. So this is real language.
Just the barest suggestion of a heel is found on teenage pumps.
And this is our non-words control.
Home oi re holili shoring nay sayoli with re post the book.
In both of these conditions, you are looking at a screen, you're listening to some background noise, you're seeing the same letters of the alphabet. We're not interested in the parts of the brain that are doing those things. So we ignore those, and we look for regions that light up when we read sentences, but not nonsense words. This gives us the precise brain regions that specifically process language and not other things. And so, people do reading and listening tasks in the scanner, while we take pictures of their brain. And over the years, we've scanned close to 1,000 people to get this beautiful map of the language network in the brain. We call our map, which is an aggregate of all these different people's language networks, the Language Atlas, or LANA for short. So now let's go back to our friend E.G. As you can see, E.G. is missing this part of her brain, which is right here, the left temporal lobe. And you can see from the map that this part is pretty important for processing language. And by language, we mean anything from talking, writing, listening, to reading. And given what we saw with Phineas Gage and HM, what do you think might have happened to E.G.? Well, you might think that she has trouble with language. But amazingly, she does not. She is actually a very successful lawyer who has picked up multiple languages over the course of her life. In fact, she does not exhibit any cognitive deficits at all. Instead, growing up, E.G. never realized she was missing this part of her brain until she was 20 years old. She had a routine medical test which accidentally detected an unusual reading from her brain, which is when they discovered this large hole. But E.G. has never had brain surgery, and she has never had a head injury in her entire life. The doctors speculate that when a hole like this develops, it actually starts to develop when you're a baby, when you have a stroke either in your mother's womb or shortly after birth, and the missing brain will therefore go undetected because there's no behavioral signs, maybe for your entire life. When E.G. told us about her special brain, we wanted to figure out which parts of her brain were responsible for language, given that she could still speak, read, and write perfectly well. So we put her in the brain scanner to do a bunch of language tasks and other cognitive games, because we wanted to see which parts of her brain she would use to do them. And what did we find? In fact, she had the exact same language network from the LANA map, but flipped onto the other side, on the right hemisphere, like a mirror image. Greta, one of the scientists in our lab, published a paper on this, and a lot of people read it. And some of them wrote to our lab saying, hey, I have the same kind of interesting brain. So we've now met several such people with interesting brains. People who are missing various parts of the brain, but show no behavioral changes or differences. The exciting thing about this is that it means not every part of the brain is necessary for a specific function. Though this depends on how and why you lost that part of your brain, remember Phineas. And that the brain has the ability to change which parts are responsible for which function, in the case of some major types of structural change. People sometimes call this neuroplasticity, but it is a more mysterious phenomenon than you might think. For instance, this is our friend, HS's brain. She is also missing the left temporal lobe, the same as EG, whose language network, if you remember, flipped to the right hemisphere. So here, this is an axial cut of your brain like this. You can see EG's language network is on the right side, not on the left, where her hole is. And in HS's case, her language parts did not get flipped to the right. They stayed on the left, but were shoved over to the edges of the hole. Our brains are definitely very flexible, and they're more flexible when you're a baby, even more so when you're in the womb. As you get older, it takes more effort for the brain to change itself. This is why, for instance, it's easier to pick up a language if you're a child and gets more difficult when you're an adult. So you might think that if you lose a part of your brain very early on, then it's possible for the brain to quickly rewire and adapt to the change, resulting in these 0 to very few behavioral deficits. However, we've also met people who got their lesions pretty recently, as adults. For example, this is GG's brain. His temporal lobe was removed when he was in his late 20s, only a couple of years ago, during a brain surgery. As you might recall, the left temporal lobe is the one used to process language. However, even though his surgery was later in life, only a few years ago, he also has no language difficulties. In HX's case, though, his surgery resulted in the loss of his ability to form new memories. Why this difference? Well, we're hoping to find out. We will run many more brain scans with many more interesting brains to see where all these neural networks move to and how they shuffle around in order to answer fundamental questions about brain organization. We want to know the answers to these questions because we're deeply interested in how the brain works. But we also hope that one day we can use this knowledge to help patients on their path to recovery from brain injury by knowing how the brain rewires. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And then I can take a few questions. Yeah, go ahead.
For the area of the brain that gets removed by injury or by birth, it's not showing the same way when it's cut or imaged. What fills that space within the skull?
Right. It's actually, so inside of brain lesions, no matter when they develop, is usually cerebrospinal fluid. It's the same stuff that's in like your spinal column and surrounding the brain. And so that just fills in. It's essentially like a watery liquid with some nutrients in it. Oh, yeah?
For the parts of the brain where the temporal information moves to,
Yeah.
do those parts of the brain then take on the added information that they have to process while still doing their original job?
So are you asking if the parts that, like where the activation is flipped, if the thing that they were originally doing still activates there? It seems like not. It seems like what was originally there gets moved over. But we're still doing analysis on that, and yeah, it's a big open question. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so you know how like kids' brains are like smaller than adult brains, right? So like you said holes. Like what if a kid, so they have a hole, will the hole like when they get like into adult, will it get bigger or will it stay the same size?
That's a great question. It seems like the hole grows in proportion to the brain's growth. So if you have a hole that's like about a fourth of your brain or something, it might grow, but it's somehow in proportion to how the brain develops as you age. But that depends on the type of lesion. So there's a lot of variability. That's a great question.
So for EG's brain, you said that the region for language like a flip to the other side, the middle side. So that travel is gradually moved there or jump to their suddenly or what?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't know because we only found out about EG, a few years ago when we started to scan her. It would be great if essentially we could find some examples of these interesting brains really early on when somebody's a kid, because then we can track the changes in their functional activations over time. But right now we only have a cross section in the sense of one time point in a person's life.
How do they lose part of their brain?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. So basically, we're going off of what the medical doctors speculate has happened. What they think is the child gets a stroke essentially when they're inside their mom's womb, and so it's called perinatal stroke. And so that part of the brain will have a stroke, and that part of brain tissue will die and will fill with cerebrospinal fluid while inside of the womb. And then when the child's born, they don't show any signs of any problems, so there's no reason to scan their brain. They don't think that anything went wrong, that stroke is not, you didn't detect anything going wrong during the pregnancy, so people can not know about this their entire life, actually. Yeah. It's a great question.
Is there a correlation between the age that you lose a brain region and whether a person will behave normally? Or is it more about what location the missing region is in? Like, what's more important?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question that we're interested in. The sort of like a priori assumption is that if you lose it younger, it's better because you can adapt to it. But for instance, with Gigi's brain, who was just up there, he lost his brain tissue like 2 years ago, and his lesion's about the same size as EG and HS's. So, and he's not showing any deficits at all. So, we thought the answer to that question was you had to lose it when you were a baby, but it seems like actually it could be much later. And we don't know exactly what determines whether or not your brain reorganizes or not, because in the case of HM or Phineas Gage, that did cause large deficits. So we don't know the answer, but we want to know the answer to the question. Yeah.
Do you know if partial brain transplant surgery is possible or if possible in the future?
Yeah, I have no idea. I guess we're so far away from that it's hard for me to imagine, but I mean, I suppose it's a theoretical possibility. We could exactly map what one of these sections does. The brain's really interconnected. I don't know. That's like for the neuroengineers, basic scientists.
I suppose these are just extreme cases or these are outlier cases. This is not typical when you hurt your brain and you get removed and you will be magically back to normal, right? I just want to confirm.
Yeah, so yes, but we also don't know because these are virtually undetectable. People have no idea that they have this hole or lesion because behaviorally they're fine. So basically we don't know the incidence rate in the normal population. It could be, I mean, we just don't know. It could be very high. Yeah, the guess is that it's not. The guess is that it's rare because it's so crazy, but in truth, you don't know. Yeah, it's a good question.
Why are children's brains more malleable? Like when you're younger, why are their brains more moldable, like literally?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't think neuroscientists fully know the answer, but I think that one thing is that the brain is still in the process of developing, so connections are still being formed. So one theory is that if you lose a part of your brain or if you sustain damage when you're a kid, the brain is still rewiring, so it will just let's say it was trying to, wire like this, but you lose that part of the brain, it will just start to rewire in the other direction. Whereas over time, the brain crystallizes, the connections crystallize. And so if you lose a section of your brain, then it's going to be harder to wire, because you're not in the rewiring phase anymore. Everything's already set.
Oh, okay.
Great question, yeah.
So if like the part of your brain that you use for language, if it moves, so what if it moves to like a place where like you need it for something else? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like that part of the brain is for like color. Like where does color go or does like sharing or what happens?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and that's one of the things that we're actually currently trying to analyze, like right now. It seems like things are more squished, basically, if you lose a part of your brain and things have rewired. And it is possible that there's more sharing of resources when this happens, but we don't know the answer yet. It's a great question because it seems like if you lost that real estate, it's got to come from somewhere. So that's a really great intuition that you have.
Is it true that some left-handed people have language processing in the right side of their brain?
Yes, that is correct. Although left lateralization of the language network is the most common thing, and it's what we see most of the time, some people do have a right lateralized language network anyways. So yeah, I suppose one theory could be that E.G. was a right lateralized language network person already. We would have to basically test this more and have more examples to know if this is a higher proportion of the case when people have a lesion on the left side, or if it's just a fluke, basically. So yeah, it's a great question, and it's true that sometimes it's right lateralized. Oh. Yeah.
Sorry, can you explain how you measure where the speech is, like where the boundaries is, or how does that measure?
Yeah, I think that a few slides back I showed the two videos of the language, the real sentences, like normal language, versus the fake words that orthographically look like words but are not actually. They're like fake words like the Jabberwocky poem. So we look at what parts of the brain respond when you're processing real language, but not this matched control that is similar to language in sort of visual or auditory features, but is not actually meaningful speech or meaningful text. And so we look at that difference, and we find which regions of the brain, when you do that subtraction, are activated only for the critical condition and not for the control condition. And that determines which.
Like using an EEG or what?
Oh, with an fMRI. So that was the, yeah. Great. I don't know how many questions I
I think we're going to start, Jared.
Jared, yes, okay, great. Well, thank you guys so much.